Hello, and thank you very much for joining us for another Betting People episode. This week, I have a very special guest. You might well have seen him and seen some of his work in The Guardian. You might well have seen him on Twitter talking about the gambling industry writ large. I'm joined by the author of Jackpot, How Gambling Conquered Britain, Rob Davies. Thank you very much, Rob, for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. Much appreciated.
So you're quite well known, I think, in gambling industry circles, but some of the people watching might not know exactly who you are. So give us a bit of a personal background on yourself and how you ended up writing about gambling.
Sure. So I'm a business reporter. I've been a business reporter for about 12 or 13 years at a number of newspapers. Ended up at The Guardian in 2015. And after about a year there, I was asked to look at what they call the sins beat. So the sins would be alcohol, tobacco, and gambling. That's not an official title, I stress. It's just a sort of an informal description of those areas. And so I started writing about gambling, not having known a great deal about it before, not having a huge amount of personal experience of gambling. I'd never been a gambler really myself. I had briefly written about gambling for the Daily Mail many years ago, and been taken to Ascot by Ladbrokes, which I think some people who know my work now would probably be surprised by. And I started writing about the gambling industry around the time that fixed odds betting terminals became sort of headline news. Ended up writing a great deal about those. And I've never looked back, really. And I've been doing it for about 5 or 6 years. Got to the point where I thought I've written enough stories to fill a book, so I might as well write a book.
And how have your views in general on the industry evolved during that time? Because your beats is covered across a lot of change. As you know, we were in the FOBT era, and now we're in the era of not only arguments about harm prevention, etc., but also on the other side, stake restrictions, etc., etc. And I wondered how your views had evolved through that period.
I think my views have become more nuanced than they used to be. I know that, for those people out there who follow my Twitter account and so on, I sometimes get a reputation as being a bookie basher or being anti-gambling. I don't think those things are true, although people are entitled to their opinion. I think when I started out, I was probably more down that road, especially with fixed odds betting terminals, because I couldn't really see a social benefit to those machines. And, I spent time in bookies in wherever it was, Newham High Street, Birmingham, various other places, watching people play FOBTs. And I just saw so much misery and distress. And it didn't strike me as an activity that could be compared with, say, enjoying horse racing, where there's clearly a sort of long, centuries-old tradition there, and and lots that goes along with it, other than just sort of dumbly sticking a few quid in every few seconds, hoping to get something back. So yeah, when I started off, I think I was pretty much 100% critical, and I think I didn't understand some of the nuances about different elements of the industry and what a diverse industry it was. And as I started to learn more, I think I've tried to draw a distinction between the parts of the industry where there is behaviour that I and many of my readers would think of as being predatory, and the parts of the industry that aren't like that, or where less of that behaviour goes on. I think what tends to happen is, you get tarred with the brush that you sort of start out with. So I think a lot of people think that because of how vocal and how critical I could be maybe 4 or 5 years ago, that my views haven't really changed. That's not really the case. I think these days I know a lot more people within the industry than I used to, and I have some of those kind of back channel conversations with people about the way things are, and I think I understand different points of view, more different points of view than once I did. At the same time, I'm a journalist. We write about when things go wrong. We don't write about things when they go right. I mean, that's kind of the nature of the beast, right? Every ship that sails doesn't have a news story written about it, but everyone that sinks does. So, I think for that reason, we sort of get seen as being a bit negative. I think people have to accept that that's sort of part of the game. That's part of the way news coverage works. So yeah, my views have changed. I think writing the book, I've tried to be even-handed where I can be, but ultimately I spend so much of my time talking to people who've been harmed by gambling that it's difficult not to have your view sort of coloured by that to an extent.
Going on to sort of gambling harm in this general area, we're now coming up to, or in the midst of a gambling review, and it's really tied in with a lot of the work that you've been doing. What do you think the gambling review might achieve, and what would you want it to? What would a sort of refreshed industry look like? Is there anything in particular that you'd want to see?
I mean, I think there's broad agreement from the people who are perhaps more within what some may consider the anti-gambling camp, whether that's people who want reform, and from within the industry, that something needs to change, right? The law that currently governs gambling was written in 2005. It was implemented in 2007, and the iPhone was invented and hit the market in 2006. So you're talking about a legislative landscape that exists without really the concept of being able to gamble via a personal device written into it. So I think what we need to see now doesn't necessarily need to be affected by legislation. There's plenty that can be done now, incidentally, via the Gambling Commission and so on. But I don't want to sort of get into the trap of writing out a personal manifesto of what I would like to see in gambling reform. I'm not the Minister for Gambling. I haven't sat there and received all the evidence from everybody about it. I mean, I think there are a few areas that are being looked at that I think, depending on how you did them, might be profitable. So the idea of a gambling ombudsman, so that we're in those situations where you get a dispute between a customer and a company over social responsibility and things like that. At the moment, the Gambling Commission just decides whether there's been a license breached. It doesn't really intervene in that kind of sort of focal point where harm may have occurred and where somebody maybe needs some kind of reimbursement or retribution or something like that. So I think gambling ombudsman might be a good idea. I know affordability checks are the big hot button issue, right? And I know a lot of people in the horse racing industry are worried about that, this idea that the government's going to intrude into your sort of personal financial affairs if you want to get a bet on. I think part of that reluctance is informed by the suggestion in one or two documents that have been written that the affordability checks come in at £100. I don't think that is realistic, and I don't think it's necessarily desirable, and I don't think that's what we're going to see happen. However, I do think there probably is a level of, whether it's deposit or loss, depending on how you want to calculate it, at which we do need to be more careful about whether people are gambling more than they can afford. And I'm pretty sure that the gambling minister will be looking at that. A single customer view is an interesting one. I think that's one that a lot of punters will be very cynical about. Single customer view is basically the idea that instead of one company deciding whether or not you're displaying signs of problem gambling, everybody's sharing the information. So you can't just, if you are an addict and you get shut down by one company, you can't just go and gamble somewhere else and experience the same harm that you would have done. The idea of single customer view is that everybody's sharing this information that flags up, that you're chasing your losses at 3 a.m. on the slot machines or something. I think a lot of horse racing punters that I've spoken to will definitely feel that that's going to be used to help companies more efficiently shut down winning punters. I think the answer to that potentially is to make that have a third party involved in that, rather than allowing the companies to do that, to be in charge of that themselves. What else? I mean, I think funding for treatment is certainly a big issue. Putting that in the hands of the NHS, making sure that GPs understand gambling addiction, because at the moment, so many addicts I speak to have been to their GP. It's their first port of call. The GP knows about nicotine addiction, they know about alcoholism, but they haven't got the first clue about gambling addiction. They don't know how to spot the signs or where to send people. So I think that's another important element. I mean, we could sit here all day talking about stuff that might be in the gambling review. I don't have a crystal ball. I think there will be significant change. I think it'll fall somewhere in the middle of what most of the reform campaigners want and what the industry would like.
Now, an interesting question I got posed with somebody else sort of when I did some research was, you've spoken a lot about gambling regulation, particularly in Britain. Is there a country, is there an example where you think there's been the right balance struck between stopping harm prevention and still allowing people who want to gamble sort of get on with things relatively uninterrupted? Is there any country comes to mind with that?
I'm not sure I could point to a country and say they've got it right. I mean, this regulation of a complex and diverse industry like gambling is incredibly complicated, right? And, you know, I was critical of the Gambling Act earlier, but fair play to the UK. They're one of the first countries to really try and get a grip on this and to try to do it. And, you know, and we didn't see that necessarily in other countries. I think there are countries where it's obviously gone wrong. Australia would be a good example of that, I think. The idea of a sort of an institution that is essentially a bookmaker and a pub at the same time doesn't seem to be erring on the right side of caution to me. And I think there are legitimate points being made by people in the industry that where gambling is entirely prohibited or extremely strictly regulated, you have seen the black market profit from that. So no, look, I don't know if there are. I think there are countries where there have been measures implemented that some people would want to see in the UK. I mean, there are prohibitions on gambling advertising around sport in, I think, Spain and Italy, if I'm right in saying it. And I think there are, you know, definitely arguments to be made for that. You know, where you draw the line is probably a matter of personal taste. But no, I couldn't single out a country. I think the one that's going to be really interesting will be the US. Because as you know, that's the huge growth market right now after the Supreme Court decision. And, you know, when has the US ever really shown an appetite for helping people who fall through society's safety nets, threadbare safety nets, and experience harm? They certainly don't do that in terms of treating people who are ill. So, you know, I'll be fascinated to see where that goes.
There are some people who do make their living from gambling, professional punters and the like. And I just wanted to ask in general, where do you think they might end up sort of post sort of review in general? Because some have issues getting on now, for example, and some are also sort of really vulnerable sort of to the backlash we've had from some operators recently in terms of limiting stakes. Do you think there's a place for professional gamblers in this system? And if so, what might it be? I realize it's an open-ended question because we don't know exactly where the cards will fall, but I wanted your thoughts generally on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's not something I've considered that much until recently because for obvious reasons, you know, as a news reporter, you're sort of trying to unearth instances of social injustice and things like that need to be put right. And, you know, top of people's list of priorities of who needs help, you know, is not professional gamblers by and large. But I have become more interested in that in the last few months in particular, especially after writing about stake factoring, you know, the mechanisms by which people's ability to bet a certain amount is dialed down, you know, whether that's because they're doing something dodgy or whether it's because they're beating the price time and again. I mean, I have seen arguments out there for putting something into the legislation that forces bookies to take a bet if it's honest. It's not an area of legislation I've given much thought to, and I wouldn't like to express an opinion necessarily on it. I think I have seen people say, well, if I'm forced to give a bank statement so that I can get a bet on, well, I won't do that. I mean, I'm a little skeptical about that. I must say. I mean, there are lots of walks of life in which you have to give over personal details in order to be able to do something, whether that's getting a mortgage or boarding a plane or whatever it might be. And I think, you know, if you really love gambling or if you make your living from it, that's not going to be too high a barrier for you. I wouldn't say.
Maybe not for a pro punter, but for a recreational punter, you know, some would reply, I'm not wanting to gamble huge amounts. I'm not wanting to get on, say, 4-figure sums or whatever. I wanted to have normal recreational bets, which would be broadly equal to the rest of my retail spend. Should I have to give bank statements to do that? I don't have to do that for, say, shopping or leisure or going out.
Right. I understand that argument, but then I think at that point, but you're talking about where the limit would be set. I mean, I mentioned £100 earlier. If it was much higher than that, you're not catching most recreational gamblers because most people are not putting those kinds of amounts on. So I don't know. Is there a situation in which you have a cap that is sufficiently low that it's catching some recreational gamblers, but it's also not inconveniencing professional gamblers? It's quite hard as to where you set that limit. But the idea that the government's going to be looking over your bank statements because you put on a £5 ACCA at the weekend, that's not going to happen. And so I think this idea that people's leisure activity is going to be intruded on at relatively low levels is for the birds, really. And then, of course, the other point is that we were talking about a soft cap, not a cap where you can't gamble beyond that, right? So the idea is, in theory, you're being asked to mount one hurdle on one occasion or maybe once a year. I mean, if that's too much for people, you have to question how important leisure activity it is to them. And I understand the civil liberties argument, I really do. But at the end of the day, this is about trying to prevent some serious harm that's going on. And I know some people will say that it's a minority of people who are being seriously harmed. It's quite a lot of people, and I've spoken to a lot of them. And the vast majority of people don't want to spend their time talking to a newspaper journalist about very difficult and painful things that have happened in their life, right? So the people I'm talking to are in many ways just the tip of the iceberg. So I think if you're setting about trying to balance people's civil liberties versus preventing harm, there's never going to be a balance that is 100% perfect. But I think people have to understand that there is a widespread feeling that the balance isn't right at the moment. It needs to be tilted a little bit further in the favour of those who would like to see vulnerable people and addicts and people who can't afford it have a little bit more friction between themselves and losing large amounts of money to what are in many cases FTSE 100 companies that are making handsome profits at the moment.
One thing that people do talk about a lot, and we have also in our interview here, is the Gambling Commission. And you said earlier that there might be sometimes more they can do. People have a lot of strong opinions regarding the Gambling Commission. Are there any changes you'd like to see made to that organisation, the way it operates?
I mean, I think the key thing is more money, really. I mean, this isn't just a Gambling Commission problem, it's a kind of UK enforcement problem. You see this with things like the Serious Fraud Office as well, and the National Crime Agency. When companies transgress the rules in the United States, they get absolutely hammered, like huge fines, hundreds of people working on these cases, and by and large, they don't do it again. In the UK, and I'm not talking about gambling firms here, I'm talking about things like bribery and corruption and so on, go unpunished again and again and again because we have underfunded enforcement authorities. Now, there's a bit of that going on with the Gambling Commission, and I think that probably harms both sides. I mean, there are probably gambling operators who would like to see the Gambling Commission be a more efficient outfit that is, able to explain to them exactly how and where, the line is drawn, and how they can avoid crossing it. But there are times when the Gambling Commission is under-resourced and doesn't do that. By the same token, there are people who think that it's not doing enough to protect vulnerable people because it takes too long to investigate allegations and the rest of it. I think there's some other interesting areas. At the moment, the Gambling Commission has a kind of aim to permit mandate. It's written into its mandate. It has to aim to permit gambling where possible. And I can see the reasons for that, right? We're talking about a leisure pursuit that is legal. But at the same time, what that also means that they're always slightly playing catch up when there are products that they think are dangerous, like fixed odds betting terminals, or there are some other products that are associated with quite high rates of harm, like virtual sports or certain slot machine products. They've always got to let that go, and it's only when they're presented with incontrovertible evidence that those products are harmful that they can act. And for the most part, that evidence doesn't exist because the research is not being done, the work is not being done operators not necessarily releasing the data. So I think, she's actually going back to one of the points you made earlier about what could be done in the Gambling Act. I think one of the things they're really looking at is data, and about forcing companies to share that data with the regulator. Now, the regulator, as it stands, will not be able to cope with receiving and passing that volume of data. So it's going to need more money.
Yeah.
It's going to need more resource.